The great being, wishing to reveal the prerequisites of the peace and tranquility of the world and the advancement of its peoples, hath written, the time must come when the imperative necessary for the holding of a vast and all-embracing assemblage of men will be universally realized. The rulers and kings of the earth must needs attend it, and participating in its deliberations, must consider such ways and means as will lay the foundations of the world's great peace amongst men. Such a peace demandeth that the great power should resolve, for the sake of the tranquility of the peoples of the earth, to be fully reconciled among themselves. Should any king take up arms against another, all should unitedly rise and prevent him. If this be done, the nations of the world will no longer require any armaments, except for the purpose of preserving the security of their realms and of maintaining internal order within their territories. This will ensure the peace and composure of every people, government, and nation. Baha'u'llah.
Baha'u'llah has drawn the circle of unity. He has made a design for the uniting of all the peoples and for the gathering of them all under the shelter of the tent of universal unity. This is the work of the divine bounty, and we must all strive with heart and soul until we have the reality of unity in our midst, and as we work, so will strength be given unto us. Abdu'l-Baha. True civilization will unfurl its banner in the midmost heart of the world whenever a certain number of its distinguished and high-minded sovereigns, the shining exemplars of devotion and determination, shall, for the good and happiness of all mankind, arise with firm resolve and clear vision to establish the cause of universal peace. They must make the cause of peace the object of general consultation and seek by every means in their power to establish a union of the nations of the world. They must conclude a binding treaty and establish a covenant, the provisions of which shall be sound, inviolable, and definite. They must proclaim it to all the world and obtain for it the sanction of all the human race. This supreme and noble undertaking, the real source of the peace and well-being of all the world, should be regarded as sacred by all that dwell on earth. Abdu'l-Baha.
This week, our speaker is Dr. Elena Mustakova, and her topic is, what is the Baha'i vision for collective healing and security? Dr. Elena Mustakova is a psychologist, educator, counselor, writer, social scientist, and former professor in adult developmental psychology. Her work is inspired by Baha'i ontological understanding of reality as a spiritual phenomenon of the evolution of consciousness. She's the author of Critical Consciousness, a study of morality in global historical context, and senior editor of Toward a Socially Responsible Psychology for a Global Era. She's received academic recognition for her scholarship on the development of moral consciousness and the rethinking of psychology to address the spiritual and social needs of our times. She's a member of the Sustainable Development Goals Thought Leaders Circle and founder of the Unitive Justice and Global Security Thought Leaders Circle. Her recent book, Global Unitive Healing, Integral Skills for Personal and Collective Transformation, has been called a hymn to collective sanity, offering potent and wise medicine for our time. Elena currently serves the spiritual empowerment of individuals and communities in Bulgaria, as she also works and speaks globally on fostering the transformation of consciousness to meet the challenges of a planetary age. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Mustakova.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. And thank you to all the participants for this wonderful opportunity to share and discuss together the Baha'i vision for collective healing and security. It is really my privilege today under this topic to try to connect the dots between what we're all experiencing at this time, the intensity of the global turbulence that we're living in, and the historic events ever since the 19th century, as well as where all of this is pointing us. It's really important to put today's experience in a little bit of historical context. And even though our rather mechanistic and consumerist Western civilization has taught us to be very much in the now of what we're able to consume, a historical perspective is critical. So it helps to remember that since the establishment of industrialization in Western societies, there was a deep disillusionment with the deadening impact of mechanization on the human spirit. A lot of movements arose in the turn between the 18th and the early 19th century, and some of them were messianic movements in the early part of the 19th century, which were in one way or another expecting the return of prophetic figures of the past. Among these, the most dramatic messianic movement was the movement that arose around the youthful figure of the Bab in ancient Persia, today's Iran. The Bab, who called himself the Gate, appeared in order to proclaim what he said would be the coming of the promised one of all earlier scriptures. The Bab taught his followers that humanity stood on the threshold of an era that would witness the restructuring of all aspects of life. New fields of learning, as yet inconceivable, would permit even the children of the New Age to surpass the most erudite of contemporary scholars. And aren't we witnessing that today? He also taught that the human race was called by God to embrace these changes through undertaking a transformation of its moral and spiritual life. His own mission, he said, was to prepare humanity for the event that lay at the heart of these developments, the coming of that universal messenger of God, he whom God will make manifest, awaited by the followers of all religions. Baha'u'llah's revelation, which came in the mid-19th century under the most extreme circumstances, released a vision and an impulse towards profound transformation of every aspect of modern human life. In his own words, his revelation has deranged the equilibrium of the world and revolutionized mankind's ordered life. His world-shaking, world-energizing, world-redeeming spirit, which the Bab has affirmed, is vibrating in the innermost realities of all created things, initiated a dramatic historical process of rapidly escalating crisis, incomprehensible to most people even today, and unprecedented in the annals of the human race. As the guardian of the Bahá'í Faith, Shoghi Effendi, wrote in the mid-20th century, quote, "In the convulsions of contemporary society, in the frenzied worldwide ebullitions of men's thoughts, in the fierce antagonisms inflaming races, creeds, and classes, in the shipwreck of nations, in the downfall of kings, in the dismemberment of empires, in the extinction of dynasties, in the collapse of ecclesiastical hierarchies, in the deterioration of time-honored institutions, in the dissolution of ties, secular as well as religious, that had for so long held together the members of the human race, we see a destined human awakening towards our oneness and interdependence, and a cleansing movement towards purging human society from the half-truths and moral compromises of many centuries, which will lead to the creation of a united global society." That, indeed, is the vision of the Bahá'í Faith, which is now inspiring and moving millions of people around the world. Friends, Baha'u'llah made clear that his revelation embodies the promised return of Christ and also the return of the prophetic figures promised in every wisdom tradition of the past. He continued their teachings into the modern age for the purpose of the establishment of universal peace. His teachings, intended for a humanity now mostly literate, interconnected like never before in history, and ready to come of age, address every aspect of modern moral, political, economic, environmental, and spiritual life. He prophesied that the intensity of purging crisis will escalate and persist. Over 170 years later, his prophetic words may ring even more true to us today. Here's what he said in the mid-19th century, and you can reflect on how deeply it applies to the conditions that are intensifying by the day in this time that we live. The world, he said, is in travail, and its agitation waxeth day by day. Its face is turned towards waywardness and unbelief. Such shall be its plight, that to disclose it now would not be meet and seemly. Its perversity will long continue. And when the appointed hour is come, there shall suddenly appear that which shall cause the limbs of mankind to quake. Then, and only then, will the divine standard be unfurled, and the nightingale of paradise warble its melody. Friends, it's important to pause and reflect on these words. When we are embarking on this topic of global healing, we have to recognize the depth of the crisis from which we're suffering. Some of them have been long time coming. For example, the deepening political and economic crisis in the world. The deep and intractable governmental and corporate corruption in every country, which is draining and deflecting resources from where they're most needed. The ingrained racial prejudices, which seem to be escalating. The rampant materialism, which has become even more unrestrained in recent decades. The widespread loss of relationship to the sacred, to the mystery of creation, and accompanying it, moral licentiousness. These are processes that have been underway ever since the industrialization began. And then there are the more dramatic processes that we have witnessed recently, such as the persistent pandemic, which has now also brought with itself other new scourges such as monkeypox, and keeps transforming. Also, the extreme climate and weather conditions such as fires and droughts that are really overtaking the planet. And the intensifying global threat of war, including atomic conflict. The times that we're living in are very, very troubled. And even as we try to operate in our daily lives and raise our families and protect our families, it's becoming increasingly apparent that the condition of society is affecting all of us. This is actually what propelled me to write my book, Global Unity of Healing, which received the 2022 Nautilus Award for best response to this historical moment. I wrote this book when the pandemic began, and it was written as a response to the massive search for meaning and purpose under conditions of deepening crisis and uncertainty. It is based on my 30 years of clinical practice, and it is informed by my Bahá'í spiritual perspective, as it seeks to offer a path to ground ourselves in practical understanding and skills, spiritual as well as social, as well as psychological. So let's talk about healing. What are we needing to heal at this time? Perhaps the most profound affliction is the myth of our separateness. The idea that we're separate from each other, that we are also able to be separate from society and live in our own bubble. And also the separateness that we try to maintain between different aspects of our lives and inner reality. There is a level of fragmentation which we are experiencing, which is the source of more psychological suffering than many of us recognize. On the other hand, what science, as well as wisdom traditions and the Bahá'í Faith are telling us is that inner and outer, individual and social, are like a amoeba's strip. They cannot be separated. They are one. The inner is manifested in the outer is manifested in the inner, and how we are in every corner of our lives affects every other corner of our lives. So what we are faced with is to begin to face, acknowledge, and reconcile the disparate personal, social, and cultural beliefs that we have, to learn how to integrate and harmonize them into wholeness. And that is what the Baha'i Faith teaches as the way of unity. What are some examples of this fragmentation? Well, they abound, forgive me, all around us. But an obvious example is the preoccupation with material comfort and consumerism in even religious people who emphasize their faith. Also, the distinct differences between the beliefs we often profess and the unexamined attitudes we manifest towards different groups, ethnic, religious, or other. Another one is the unquestioned social standard of social competitiveness and emphasis on appearances of success, even as we profess spiritual values. So our fragmentation is wherever we look. In the Baha'i Faith, as in previous wisdom traditions, people are encouraged to bring themselves to account each day, because it is understood that this growth from fragmentation and compartmentalization towards genuine wholeness is a lifelong process. It is also understood that this inner and outer fragmentation is the source of our suffering. Psychological fragmentation is the source of mental suffering. That is at the core of most of the conditions we see in our clinical offices, from anxiety and depression to various disorders, personality disorders, addictions, and many other conditions that are abounding now. At the core of them is always what we're dealing with: psychological fragmentation. Different parts of our being, different parts of our lives are not speaking to one another. In the same way, social fragmentation causes tremendous social suffering. And we can see right now how the world is literally swept by a wave of people, millions of people who have lost their homes, who are now refugees, unwanted in many places, unable to have a stable life, to educate their children, to raise their families. It is tragic. And the refugee crisis is also only increasing. We're bound to see the refugee crisis become much more unsurmountable with the extreme climate events that are escalating. So this social fragmentation are dividedness, our idea that each country is a sovereign entity that should not be accountable in any way for its internal dealings, has led to a lot of very contradictory behaviors, a lot of social suffering, and a lot of fragmentation in the world. And it's becoming increasingly difficult in these conditions to deal with the crisis that is facing the whole planet, which is the climate crisis, which requires unity of purpose and unity of action. So taking responsibility for our suffering is the call of this modern age. It is also the call of the Bahá'í Faith. From the time that the Bab appeared, and certainly throughout the 40 years of the ministry of Baha'u'llah, and ever since, there has been a profound emphasis on what Baha'u'llah called the fruit of human life. And he identified the fruit of human life as the development of knowledge, wisdom, spiritual perception, and eloquence. Baha'u'llah was very clear in his teachings that it is only as we develop these qualities of spirit and qualities of being that we will understand what it means to transform our communities, to transform our societies. So healing is really a process of bringing ourselves to account each day on an individual level, asking ourselves how we're developing greater knowledge and understanding, deeper wisdom today, deeper spiritual perception, and of course, eloquence. You may wonder, how is eloquence essential in healing? Which is actually a very interesting question and a very interesting phenomenon, that there is such a spiritual emphasis on eloquence in this modern Baha'i spiritual paradigm. In science, we now understand the powerful formative impact of language. From day one, we are shaped by the reverberations of the language we hear in utero, its accents, the things that are acknowledged, the things that are not spoken, the feeling with which they're spoken, the intonation. There is amazing research now on how much the use of language really shapes the human psyche. And of course, in clinical work, we see every day that it is through language that people can become deeply fragmented, through oppressive, violent, hurtful language. And it is also through language that people can heal, which is the essence of psychotherapeutic interventions, is people process destructive language and destructive experiences in their lives, and little by little begin to replace them with a more integrated way of thinking and speaking about themselves. And so it is truly profound that in the middle of the 19th century, the Baha'i faith elevated as one of the four fruit of human life the development of spiritual perception and an eloquent language that reflects this spiritual perception, that reflects wisdom and knowledge. In my book, Global Unitive Healing, I share a lot of clinical vignettes of people and how they have healed through the process of discovering their true reality. And in each of these cases, you see the role of language. In one particular case, I worked with a woman who was raised in a very, very violent and very verbally and emotionally abusive environment. And she was extremely, as you can imagine, distrustful of people, distrustful of social contexts, and had very, very low self-esteem. And she was profoundly affected when gradually in our process of work together, I began to introduce to her some hidden words, which are mystical selections from the Baha'i writings, they're very poetic. They do not have any kind of dogmatic beliefs introduced in them. Rather, they are these exquisite, poetic, brief messages that cause deeper reflection. And so she was very moved by some of these and began to notice that this language was treating her in a different way than she was used to being treated. Eventually, she realized that this language was making her feel more dignified, more noble. And it came time when it was possible for us to discuss the reality of her as a soul, not as a body and as a socially conditioned person full of issues with low self-esteem and fear of people, but as a soul that is having this painful, embodied, and social experience, which can be transformed as we understand ourselves as spiritual beings and really reconstruct the language with which we think about ourselves and the language in which we think about life, people, and society. So in her case, which you can see in chapter 5 of Global Unity of Healing, she was very touched by a number of different hidden words, but one I will quote here that really struck her. "O Son of Being, love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Know this, O servant." It was truly a profound moment for her to have this idea introduced through these beautiful poetic words that there is a greater love that is directed towards her, and that she has the choice to open herself to this love, and that this love is different than everything she has experienced from humans. So it was a powerful transformation. Another one that really touched her was an excerpt where Baha'u'llah actually quotes the Quran, which says, "Dost thou reckon thyself only a puny form, when within thee the whole universe is folded?" And indeed, this particular woman that I call Sarah in my chapter 5 felt very much like a puny form, very much socially conditioned, very much frightened, very much having to defend against people and social contexts every day of her life. For her, the idea that the whole universe is folded within her, and as she turns inward, she can discover the knowledge and wisdom of her heart, of her mind, her own spiritual perception, that she can find words that express that, was a whole new world. So that's an example of individual healing. Individual healing in the Baha'i faith is understood as actually the evolution of consciousness. And I should say here that my background is in developmental psychology, and particularly in adult developmental psychology. And in adult development, we do know that the structure of the adult psyche has the opportunity to evolve through many stages into genuine maturity. But that is a choice. Unlike the evolution from infancy into adulthood, some of which is a given and does occur more or less, no matter what, evolution in adult life, the evolution of adult consciousness is very, very much a choice. And that's exactly what Baha'u'llah said he came for in the mid-19th century. He came, he said, in order to call humanity to its spiritual maturity. He was very clear that all of us as individuals and collective humanity is now ready to evolve into its age of spiritual maturity. Further, he applied a profound developmental lens to collective human history long before developmental psychology actually existed as a field. As I said earlier, that was the middle of the 19th century when he spoke about the fact that collective humanity has evolved from a stage of collective infancy to childhood, early then late childhood, adolescence, through the many stages in the historical unfoldment of human civilization, and that now humanity finds itself on the verge of transition from adolescence into adulthood. And that, as we know from the individual lifespan, is a very turbulent transition. We know that adolescence emphasizes individuation, separateness. It really does not recognize its interdependence with its family, with society. It is very focused on its own appearance, on its own success. And at the same time, the struggle of the adolescent is to find their place in society, a meaningful, viable, and sustainable place in society. And that's, in a way, what collective humanity is struggling now to accomplish. We want and keep talking about universal peace, but universal peace is only attainable through processes of our collective spiritual maturity, which have been described ever since the mid-19th century and which we have to now acknowledge and own. So in one of his mystical writings called The Four Valleys, Baha'u'llah describes the process of the evolution of human consciousness through valleys, which we can view as paralleling what developmental psychology calls stages in adult development. And these valleys he calls in the Four Valleys, the Valley of Self, which in developmental psychology encompasses the first 5, sometimes 6 stages of development, the formation of the individuated self. After that, Baha'u'llah speaks of our capacity to move from the valley of self, to grow from the valley of self to the valley of reason. Very interesting spiritual suggestion there, that in order to attain genuine reason, we have to begin to grow in detachment from self. That while the self is dominant, reason is warped, it is not very clear. Certainly converging with the later findings of developmental psychology. The third valley Baha'u'llah speaks of that we emerge into through reason is the valley of love. And he describes how it is through reason that humanity discovers the mystery of creation. It is through reason that we recognize the harmony, the exquisite beauty and wisdom of creation, and the fact that there must be a wise center, a creator, and that we develop a loving relationship with this mystery, with this center, with this unknowable being that in the history of human civilization we've called God. Universal mind, ground, we have given it all kinds of names, but ultimately it is clear in the Baha'i writings that this center of wisdom is unknowable to us. It is only knowable through the manifestations in the history, in the religious history of humanity. And so the Valley of Love has the capacity to evolve into the Valley of Reason, according to Baha'u'llah. From there, we can grow into the Valley of Love, and the ultimate fruit of the evolution of human consciousness, he calls the Valley of the unity of self, reason, and love. And that is a very profound way to describe healing. It is something that we practice every day in our clinical offices. It is something that social science has now developed vast bodies of research to describe what the unity of self, reason, and love actually looks like. We have now what Baha'u'llah prophesied would become really the unity of science and religion. This religious understanding, this spiritual understanding that was revealed in the mid-19th century is fundamentally supported now by advanced social and physical science. As we know, physical sciences are making clear to us, advanced physical science is making clear to us that not only is material creation not consisting of separate objects, but it is truly an energetic field, and all seemingly separate objects, in fact, vibrate, are part of this energetic vibration of the field, influence each other and receive these influences, and therefore the life of complete awakened self-awareness, of awakened higher reason, of awakened love is essential to the healing of the whole. So here's a profound understanding of healing as evolution and integration of consciousness, an understanding that was revealed first in the mid-19th century, and that today is supported by social and physical sciences, and it's also described by philosophers such as Ken Wilber as integral healing. In other words, in the integral perspective, we now understand what the Baha'i writings say very clearly, is we cannot heal just the I if we don't heal the we, if we also don't heal the it, which is our understanding of reality, and we also don't heal our relationship to they, which is society. These are the 4 quadrants of life: I, we, it, and they. Our internal reality, our interpersonal reality, our understanding of reality, and our relationship to society. So healing is an integral process. And in this integral process, each of the 4 quadrants influence the other. Baha'u'llah was very clear that we cannot really heal if we don't understand that reality is fundamentally spiritual. And it is the spiritual nature of reality that is manifested in our material, physical, and social experiences. He was also clear that we cannot heal ourselves independent of healing our relationships, our families, and that the highest form of healing is service to what we now call in integral theory, they, the 4th quadrant, or society. It is service to society that deeply heals, not alone, of course, all 4 quadrants put together: intrapersonal, interpersonal, rational, and social perspectives. They all have to heal together. And that, of course, is a lifelong journey, both individual and collective. But this journey at this time is really, really intensifying because, as we know, both climate events and health events and political and economic events are intensifying. Why? Because we're so profoundly interdependent. And as we saw in the quotes that were shared earlier, these things are not random. These dramatic events are actually forcing us to realize that we cannot continue with business as usual. My little life over here, my little group over there, that we are so interdependent that we really have to take ownership for all 4 aspects of this process of healing: the I, the we, the it, and the they. And we have to do it today. We have to do it now. There is no time. Climate scientists are telling us that within this decade, which is literally in the next 7-8 years, climate change processes will become irreversible. For us to stem the tide of this climate change, we have to act in global unity. And we all know how disunited the world is in the moment. So it's a call to all of us. But this warning was raised 170 years ago. And humanity has continued heedlessly professing its separate beliefs that pit us against each other and not realizing how unsustainable this is. And now we're in a climactic decade. And in this decade, collective healing requires according again to Baha'u'llah's dispensation, the creation of communities of a new kind. What does that mean? These communities have to be of people who have taken on the responsibility to consciously awaken to the journey of the unity of self, reason, and love. These are communities of people that have chosen whatever faith, ethnic, religious, spiritual, cultural background they come from. They have chosen to purify their hearts, to take responsibility for their lives. Again, to quote one of Baha'u'llah's hidden words, "Oh, my brother, a pure heart is as a mirror. Cleanse it with the burnish of love and severance from all save God, that the true sun may shine therein and the eternal morning dawn." That is actually a different selection. It's not a hidden word, forgive my momentary error. But you can see here in his words, the call to purifying our hearts. So in these communities of new kind, we have the opportunity to come together and unite with people from every faith, religious, spiritual, and ethnic, cultural background. And in fact, that is the call of the Baha'i faith, that we come together, that we pray together, that we deepen and awaken together. And very importantly, that we build racial and gender equity in these communities and unity in diversity. That is the process Baha'u'llah said very clearly in the mid-19th century that will effectively begin to heal collective humanity. These centers, these communities he spoke about are actually now becoming centers of illumination. And in the teachings of his son, Abdul Baha, who amongst Baha'is is known as the master, and who traveled throughout the West in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, spreading Baha'i spiritual, psychological, and social teachings throughout the Western world. Abdul Baha explained what centers of illumination are. And again, that is a very profound and innovative Baha'i concept. He said centers of illumination have always existed in human history. Such centers are, for example, science, the creation of institutions, national institutions, governance institutions, judicial institutions, and with time, he explained, these centers of illumination serve their purpose and they become outdated. They no longer work, and new centers of illumination have to be created. And in this age, he was very clear that the center of illumination is going to be the Word of God, spiritual principles, because nothing else will hold. And this is what we're seeing now. Time-honored institutions are coming undone all around us. And the only thing that really holds are universal spiritual principles, which were taught through every religious tradition of the past and which Baha'u'llah cleansed and renewed and re-articulated for the modern age. These are centers of illumination, and these communities that uphold these principles and build unity and diversity truly become centers of illumination throughout the planet, throughout our torn, embattled, turbulent, and very unstable planet. So then what is the Baha'i understanding of moving towards global security, from global healing to global security? Again, there is the recognition throughout the writings that governance as it has existed until now in the history of human civilization, which has always been hierarchical, is becoming hopelessly inadequate for the needs of a global age. And we, of course, know now, 170 years after this Baha'i dispensation, that current forms of government have become hopelessly corrupt around the world. Corruption looks a little bit different in Bulgaria than it does in the US or in New Zealand or in Germany or in any African country, but corruption is pervasive. And we also know that corruption is pervasive throughout government and business, corporations. And so these structures don't have the collective will to come up with the decisions that are currently urgent and necessary for humanity in order to stem the tide of climate change and war. And that's the dilemma that we're facing. So security, Baha'u'llah envisioned as a radically new form of global governance through a process of electing local, national, and global councils that are democratically and anonymously elected and work consultatively. In these councils, individuals have no authority. It is the council that has authority. And mind you, this is very important to understand. These councils are elected either every year or at the most every 5 years on the global level, but they are elected anonymously. There's no campaigning. So this form of global democratic governance through elected democratic councils is a radical, revolutionary concept in the world that we're in today. But we see more and more non-governmental organizations worldwide moving towards that, pushing towards that. And at the level of the United Nations, probably the most profound changes are being pushed forth by non-governmental organizations, which are now holding governments accountable. That was truly unthought of, unprecedented in human history, and really unthought of even just a few decades ago. So the power of the collective will is really growing. And it is very important for every one of us to understand and deal adequately with this dual and parallel processes that Baha'u'llah actually prophesied and that we're living in. On the one hand, we have the process of the disintegration of old forms of governance and social structures and a growing insecurity in the world and in every nation. And on the other hand, a parallel process of healing, unification, planetary unification, integration, and building of security of a new kind. And you probably heard that in the introduction that was offered at the beginning of my talk. It was mentioned that I've had the joy and the opportunity to come together with many other thought leaders from various scientific, faith, spiritual, and other traditions all over the world to form a synergy circle on unitive justice and global security. So here we are, people from all over the world now are working together, collaborating on ideas of unitive healing, unitive justice, and global security. These ideas, which were released and were revolutionary 170 years ago, are now really spreading all over the world and are being embraced by progressive people from all walks of life and every age. So to understand these dual processes allows us to be less disheartened, less in distress from what we see every day, the growth, truly the pandemic in anxiety and depression, suicide, addictions among younger and younger people, all kinds of dependencies. It is a very tense time, but Baha'u'llah wrote about this dialectic between light and darkness, and the fact that we have to understand this dialectic, we have to rise above it, and we have to be present to this dialectic in every moment, making a choice. And if you choose to read Global Unitive Healing, you will see how in each clinical vignette, in each chapter, people are realizing that they can make that choice. Of course, they seek help, clinical help, because they're experiencing some form of darkness in their lives. But sooner or later, people realize that we each have a choice that we have to own. And we are the authors of this transformation from light, from darkness towards light, understanding, owning the darkness within us, in our lives, in our relationships, and transforming it into light. And in that sense, the Baha'i vision is not a utopia. It is, in fact, deeply dialectical. And an example of that is how the faith understood the role of the United States, of American society, in the evolution of collective consciousness. And I am going to read here to you a quote from The Citadel of Faith, which was written by Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i Faith. Here's what he describes as the experience and also the role of the American nation in the evolution of collective consciousness at this moment in the world. Shoghi Effendi writes, "The American nation stands in grave peril. A government and people clinging tenaciously to the obsolescent doctrine of absolute sovereignty and upholding a political system manifestly at variance with the needs of a world already contracted into a neighborhood and crying out for unity, will find itself purged of its anachronistic conceptions and prepared to play a preponderating role, as foretold by Abdu'l-Baha, in the hoisting of the standard of the lesser peace, in the unification of mankind, and in the establishment of a world federal government on this planet. These same fiery tribulations will not only firmly weld the American nation to its sister nations in both hemispheres, but will, through their cleansing effect, purge it throughout thoroughly of the accumulated dross which ingrained racial prejudice, rampant materialism, widespread ungodliness, and moral laxity have combined in the course of successive generations to produce, and which have prevented it thus far from assuming the role of world spiritual leadership forecast by Abdu'l-Baha's unerring pen, a role which it is bound to fulfill through travail and sorrow." Friends, Abdu'l-Baha, whom we lovingly call the Master, called the 20th century the century of 2 world wars, genocides, a century of light, because he clearly foresaw that in this century, the world will move far closer to political, racial, and religious unity of the peoples, and will unfold new horizons of scientific accomplishment, universal undertakings, and world solidarity. And I want to read to you a quote from Abdu'l-Baha's talks that were delivered in the West, as I said, in the beginning of the 20th century, in his travels throughout the West. This particular one is very illuminating about the far-reaching vision of the Baha'i faith. In 1912, in a talk to a Unitarian church in New York, Abdu'l-Baha spoke this way. "In this great century," he said, "the most important accomplishment is the unity of mankind. Although in former centuries and times this subject received some measure of mention and consideration, it has now become the paramount issue in question in the religious and political conditions of the world. History shows that throughout the past, there has been continual warfare and strife among the various nations, peoples, and sects. But now, in this century of illumination, hearts are inclined towards agreement and fellowship. Minds are thoughtful upon the question of the unification of mankind. There is," he says, an emanation of the universal consciousness today, which clearly indicates the dawn of a great unity. Friends, again, these words were spoken in 1912, over 100 years ago. The discerning eyes of the master were seeing the beginning of the emanation of universal consciousness. Today, I can assure you as a social scientist that every forward-looking thinker, every organization that I know of around the world that is progressive in spirit is talking about unity of consciousness. He's talking about the unity of the world. In 100 years, this has become a reality. And even though the forces of darkness are very strong, the unitive narrative is the narrative of the 21st century. And we all have the opportunity to join this unitive narrative, not just in the abstract, but in the way that we work and live our lives and help healing happen in our families, in our relationships, in our communities, in our friendships, wherever we are engaged. And I would like to close here again with words of Abdu'l-Baha. All God's prophets have brought the message of love. There are many ways of expressing the love principle. There is love for the family, for the country, for the race. There is political enthusiasm. There is also the love of community of interest in service. Love is unlimited, boundless, infinite. Material things are limited, circumscribed, finite. The love of family is limited. The tie of blood relationship is not the strongest bond. Patriotic love is finite. The love of one's country, causing hatred of all others, is not perfect love. The love of race is limited. To love our own race may mean hatred of all others, and even people of the same race often dislike each other. Political love also is much bound up with hatred of one party for another. The love of community of interest in service is likewise fluctuating. Frequently, competitions arise which lead to jealousy, and at length, hatred replaces love. The great unselfish love for humanity is bounded by none of these imperfect, semi-selfish bonds, and can only be achieved by the power of the divine spirit. No worldly power can accomplish the universal love. That is the call of the Baha'i dispensation, that people of every faith, of every race, should unite through the power of the divine spirit and truly reorganize this planet so that it can be sustainable and peaceful for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustakova, for your thoughts and sharing all of that. We really appreciate it. So now we have time for questions. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat. I'll start us off. So, the last quote you read about, transcending the love of your own, particular nation or people, but what would you say to someone who says that humans are naturally born loving their own family or their own tribe or kind, and it's not really realistic to expect people to love the whole world or people they don't know?
That's a great question. It is true that as we grow and develop, we start with very limited loyalties, but we can never forget developmental perspective. So a child first identifies as an extension of its primary caretaker. Then it identifies with family. Then it identifies with its peer group. Then it begins to broaden its identifications. So as early young adults, we do have to find our place in society, and that means identifying with certain groups, with certain roles, professional or other. So more limited identifications are certainly natural as part of the developmental process. It is not, however, a given that we should remain limited by them. In fact, what is given, if anything, and that's what science is showing us now, which is something the Baha'i faith is very clear about, it is given to us to evolve. The evolution of consciousness proceeds from more limited to wider circles of loyalty. And eventually, the circle of loyalty encompasses the human family, not just people we know, not just people who are like us and whom we're more comfortable with. We recognize our interdependence as our minds expand, as our hearts expand, as we evolve. That's what we see. We see interdependence with fellow humans on the other side of the planet. We actually recognize our interdependence with other species, with all life in this planet. So this expansion of consciousness is actually our destiny. And the Baha'i faith is very clear about that. Our destiny is to evolve individually and collectively. That is the purpose of this embodied and social life with all of its challenges. And evolution is difficult and painful. And there is, of course, resistance and there's fears. We fear giving up our more limited loyalties in order to expand our loyalties. It is not a kumbaya process. It's a challenging process, but nonetheless, it's our destiny. And the other aspect of that, which is important, is, and again, social science is very clear about that, the more we evolve and expand our loyalties, the more we experience happiness, actually. Studies of happiness are very clear about that. The happiest people are people who connect most broadly to life and to humans.
There's a comment about how centers of illumination is a wonderful description of the Baha'i core activities that are currently happening around the world.
Well, maybe I can comment on that.
Sure.
For people who are for the first time in this forum, you may not know what these Baha'i core activities are and why they are well described as centers of illumination. But Baha'i core activities are essentially a spiritual empowerment effort, which is directed towards people of every walk of life and every religious and spiritual conviction. They are opportunities for people to come together and to study spiritual principles and their application in our immediate lives, family life, the raising of children, youth, how we participate in society, social action, etc. So these core activities, as we call them amongst other Baha'is, are actually called core activities because they are foundational to the process. They are viewed as foundational to the process of restructuring the moral and spiritual and social life on this planet. But they're by far not limited to Baha'is or primarily for Baha'is. They're a service to the whole of society. And in these circles participate people from everywhere and from all convictions, and are often invited to bring understanding from their own spiritual traditions. And that is another path to our coming together in unity, recognizing the oneness of our spiritual tradition, the universality of spiritual principles across traditions that unite us, that don't have to divide us. And as we come together to apply these, to study, to understand, to grasp, and then to apply these spiritual principles integrally, as I spoke earlier, internally, in our own personal growth and development, interpersonally, in our relationships and families and parenting, also in our relationship to society and the service to society, and also the way we do our professions. We all unite and we grow. So yes, these do become centers of illumination that are spreading a whole different metaphysic, a different ethic, and a different form of action in the world.
I think that's all our questions. Your presentation was really comprehensive. I think it really covered a lot. We really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Dr. Mustakova.
This is my pleasure. Thank you for this wonderful forum that offers so much opportunity every Saturday. It's a privilege to be able to be part of it and a great service.
Thank you. So our speaker next week will be Dr. Nader Saidi, and his topic will be Abdu'l Baha's critique of materialist philosophy. So again, these are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I've put a link to our contact form if you're not on our mailing list. And we'll end with a Baha'i prayer set to music.
Thy name is my healing, oh my God, and remembrance of thee is my remedy. Nearness to thee is my hope, and love for thee is my companion. Thy mercy to me is my healing, and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thy mercy to me is my healing, and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Thy name is my healing, oh my God, and remembrance of thee is my remedy. Nearness to thee is my hope, and love for thee is my companion. Thy mercy to me is my healing, and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thy mercy to me is my healing, and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Thou verily art the all bountiful, the all knowing, the all wise. Baha'u'llah, 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 Baha'u'llah.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Saturday. Bye.